something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today my guest is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He probably needs no introduction, so I will just briefly say that Lawrence Wilkerson is a retired U.S. Army colonel, and he was also former Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. Among other things, we will be discussing a new book for which Colonel Wilkerson wrote the foreword. The book is Deadly Betrayal: The Truth About Why the United States Invaded Iraq by former Air Force Command Master Sergeant Dennis Fritz. I think Larry Wilkerson was the perfect man to write this foreword, and the book gives us some very interesting angles to discuss related to the Iraq War and to the bigger issue of how and why the neocons took the wheel of U.S. foreign policy and steered the empire over a cliff. This episode of Devil's Chess Club is available to everyone courtesy of For Died Trying, the new documentary film series which explores the extraordinary lives and cataclysmic assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and RFK. This episode of Devil's Chess Club is available to everyone courtesy of For Died Trying, the new documentary film series which explores the extraordinary lives and cataclysmic assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and RFK. Visit fordiedtrying.com for details. Devil's Chess Club is an American Exception production. Subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for access to the podcast that explores the deep politics of the U.S. empire. We have over 170 episodes and counting, including our ongoing series featuring Ben Howard and I as we discuss Peter Dale Scott's overlooked work on Far West and the global drug metagroup. In part 5, Ben Howard and I finally get Peter Dale Scott to join us as well. Subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon to have access to our global drug metagroup series, as well as a number of other episodes which explore the deep politics of U.S. empire. Colonel Larry Wilkerson, it's great to have you here again.
Good to be with you, Aaron.
I recently read a book that you recommended to me before it was published, so I pre-ordered it. It's called Deadly Betrayal by Dennis Fritz, and you wrote the foreword to it. This is a book about Iraq, the Iraq War, and why the United States invaded, and it's a pretty amazing book from an insider perspective. It's short, it's very readable, and he is very candid about some of these issues that are normally suppressed, especially the role of very hardline pro-Israel, pro-Likud, political constituencies that seem to be driving key parts of this. How can you tell me your involvement with this book and how much you consulted with Fritz about this, and how did you come to write the foreword?
It was an interesting story, which we told in New York and at Busboys and Poets in Washington, 2 book events we've done so far. I told Dennis I would do them with him. I was just out of the government, and he was still partially in the government, but as he was transitioning to the job he would eventually have for a couple of years, I met him, and that was the Air Force's liaison between the active duty Air Force, the Chief of Staff's office, and the Walter Reed, the new name, the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, which was then the wound capital of the universe, if you will. And he became their Wounded Warrior Program liaison. And he began to deal with some of the incredibly devastating injuries that were coming back from Iraq in hordes at that time. We had whole wings at the Walter Reed that were full of these soldiers, airmen, Marines, and others. And by serendipity, I met him one day. I think I was over there doing something at Walter Reed myself, routine medical affair. And I met him, and he said, "Oh, you were Colin Powell's chief of staff, huh?" Oh, we got to talking and everything. He said, "Let me take you and introduce you to some of my wards." And he did. And the one that sticks in my mind vividly was the one he introduced me to in the new luxurious sort of lobby of the main building there now. I won't say his name, but let's just say he was the Air Force's at that time only triple amputee. He lost both his legs and his right arm below the elbow. He was an ordnance man in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And in the last couple of months of his tour in Afghanistan, he'd been defusing an IED and it went off and took his legs off and his right arm. One of the first things he told me was, "I wish I'd bled out on the battlefield." But then he started telling me another story that stays with me, will stay with me to the grave. He said, they come up the stair. He had 19 surgeries. And to the military's credit, to the Air Force's credit, throughout those surgeries, they brought his wife up from Florida. She was a third grade elementary school teacher, and let her have a room next to his. And he said he didn't think he would have made it if that hadn't happened. And she stuck with him through thick and thin. He said, "I got so sick and tired of the congressman coming into my room and thanking me for my service." And he was saying this to me, drinking a cup of coffee downstairs with a smile on his face, probably very rare smile on his face. He said, the last bunch that came up, they came into my room, and the lead one of them came up and said, "Thank you for your service," right off the bat. And I told him, I said, "Don't thank me for my service. Thank me for my sacrifice, which you can plainly see." He said, "They beat feet. They left. The whole delegation left my room, and I felt like I'd accomplished something." And he smiled again. That was my introduction that Dennis gave me to the detritus, if you will, the human detritus of our two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Both of us at that time thought both wars were unnecessary wars, lingering in Afghanistan and Iraq altogether. And then we began to talk periodically and then at length at lunches and things like that. And I found out he was compiling data and going to write a book. And he found out I was compiling data and thinking about the same thing. But we both had the same mental reservations. We did not want to embarrass people we had known for years, worked for, and admired. In my case, Colin Powell. And in his case, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time of the war beginning, Richard Myers. For whom Dennis had worked in various incarnations throughout the last 10 or so years of his military service. Very close to Myers. Talked to Myers about writing the book, and Myers said, essentially, you got to do what you got to do, but what are you going to say about me in it, and so forth. So Dennis was conflicted, as I was conflicted. And then finally, Dennis decided, I owe it to the men and women of the Air Force and all the rest of the people who got shot up, hurt, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, so forth. And he went ahead and did it and found a publisher, and that's the rest of the story, you know.
Right, and he says some things that are explosive that I had some idea of these things before in a general sense of them, but he puts them so explicitly and plainly that I think you have to take note. And it's perhaps more impactful when you consider that the person is not any sort of leftist or critic of imperialism by nature. He's not fundamentally someone who is approaching U.S. militarism from a critical perspective. He's been part of the U.S. military and has some loyalty to it, even though for someone like me, I can't think of anything that the U.S. military has done that you can look at in my lifetime and think that was not motivated simply by imperialism and the lust for power and global dominance. One of the things that he says, though, so his perspective makes it more compelling in a sense. He says that the invasion would have occurred even if they'd been able to oust Saddam Hussein in a coup, And he elaborates on this, saying that Tariq Aziz and others were saying at the end that they would concede to whatever the U.S. wanted. The U.S. corporations would have first rights to like mineral and oil, mining operations. And I'd heard this similarly from a peace activist who claimed to be a back channel to a CIA back channel to the Iraqis. Her name is Susan Lindauer, and she said that they offered even more than that, that they were willing to strike all kinds of crazy deals, saying they would buy, thousands of American automobiles every year. And so this really gets into this question of why did they insist on this invasion and what was the reason for it? Had the Susan Lindauer angle, by the way, she said other things that people made it possible for people to discount her. Like she talked about 9/11 and what people in the CIA had told her about that. So some people could ignore her because of those reasons. But the thing is, she was Andy Card's cousin, I believe, and she actually was jailed for no reason for, I think, the whole duration of the Bush presidency. It wasn't until I think Obama comes in that they let her out of jail. It was like a very strange case. She wasn't really tried for anything that made any sense. They just held her there, I think, because they thought her testimony was explosive. So why would they have wanted to have the war, even if Hussein was there? Why do you think that was the case? That they didn't even, it really wasn't even about Saddam Hussein, and it wasn't about getting the Iraqi regime on the side of the U.S. It was they wanted this war.
One of the things that Dennis and I had much discussion about, and we do have some disagreement in certain areas, and partly because I know Gary Vogler pretty well, and Gary wrote Iraq and the Politics of Oil, and I introduced Dennis to Gary. And then he wrote a second book. And in the second book, he sort of elongated what he said in the first book. What he said in the first book was Iraq was really not about oil. In the second book, he said, mea culpa. It was not about oil for Royal Dutch Shell or ExxonMobil or Total or any of the big private oil companies. It was oil for Israel. And let me tell you in this book, this second book, how it was oil for Israel. And then you put the two books together and you see that what was happening in Douglas Feist's office, and Douglas Feist was a traitor par excellence to the United States of America, unless you say that the United States of America and Israel's interests are so coincidental, which is what Douglas Feist would say, that it is impossible to be a traitor to the one or the other. But I think Douglas Feist was a traitor. And what he was doing, besides being surrounded by Mossad agents 24/7 in his office in the Pentagon, and Dennis does cover that, Gary covers it that there were Mossad agents who were telling him what to do in Iraq with regard to oil that he knew damn well was going to Israel. And fast forward for a moment or two, we have troops in Syria today who are there for one reason. They do not know they're there for this reason. Now, some of the officers may, but by and large, the troops don't know they're there. They're there to protect the oil that's being pumped out of a sovereign state on whose territory we have no business under international law to Israel. Oil is being pumped out of the northern part of Iraq direct to Israel. So the only thing that's keeping Israel's economy from going completely bust, and incidentally, the thing that's kept Israel's economy booming away for the 15 plus years of Netanyahu's finance ministership and then his political membership or prime minister membership, the only thing that's kept that going in a solid, fundamental way is discounted oil from both those sources. And when Dennis and I talk, Dennis is of a mind that it was all about this messianic desire to spread democracy on the part of the president. I think that's probably some truth to that. And it's all about protecting Israel writ large in terms of taking out the rest of Israel's potential enemies, starting with Iraq, then going to Syria, then going to Iran, and maybe offshooting to Lebanon even. Those were all reasons, and this is where we disagree. And my evidence, if you will, comes a lot from 400 plus case studies done on two campuses by my very good students who enlightened me in ways. I once told Colin Powell about 2015 or so, I said, I know more about the Iraq war than you will ever know, boss. What do you mean? because you and I were looking with a telescope from the State Department. And every now and then we broke out of that telescope view, maybe, but not often. I've been looking through 400 brilliant case studies done by some of the best students in this country on 2 different collegiate campuses, and I know everything about it because of that. And he was not too comfortable with that, needless to say. One of the reasons was because I discovered that he was involved in the torture program, and he denied that to me altogether. Not the big one, not the wide one that went out to the military and everyone else, but the very, very carefully orchestrated small program called the High Value Detainees Program, given to George Tenet, the director of the CIA, to do to about 14 or 15 people who were probably really Al Qaeda, to include Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, although we farmed his out to Egypt, Ibn bin the Libyan, who gave us the deal about the connections between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda, which we put out at the UN in February of 2003. He was tortured in Egypt, so by some of the worst torturers in the world, because George Tenet would shop it out every now and then. But this was the program that I found out he was conversant with, which was a real shock to me. He went to great length to deny to me that he knew anything about any of the torture program. And I think he was being honest about the wider one, where the military was involved and contractors and CIA out there in the hinterland in Afghanistan and Iraq, and at Guantanamo. But that tapestry, I think, gives me a wider view of the conflict. I have this on my cell phone. I have this picture of 2 whiteboards that my students filled one day. They did this was my master's degree students. They did a particularly good job of analyzing what they call the 8 to 10 reasons we went to war in Iraq. And they put on the board line diagrams of this person, Douglas Feith, this person, Donald Rumsfeld, this person, Paul Wolfowitz, this person, George W. Bush, this person, Colin Powell, this person, Condi Rice. And they drew lines and everything. It was a beautiful, beautiful rendition of at least 8 or 10 reasons to go to war in Iraq, and an inexperienced president at the center who couldn't differentiate any of them. And so they all got their piece of the pie, every one of them. So we went to, in my view, we went to war in Iraq for a lot of reasons, none of which justified killing people, none of which justified our people getting killed, none of which justified the war. And in that sense, Dennis is right. Dennis is absolutely right. And the only small difference we have is that I think it was a little bit bigger, and he likes to isolate in on the probably the most formidable thing, which was almost like Messianic Christianity. They wanted to clean up the region. They wanted to clean it up for Israel, and clean it up for God, and clean it up for all future endeavors that we might have over there. Very reminiscent, if you know anything about the British Empire, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century, very reminiscent of some of their conversations at the highest level when they were having grievous troubles with the British East India Company, which more powerful than His Majesty or Her Majesty, Queen Victoria. And they were having trouble with the Russians, and they were having trouble with the Persians, and they were trying to get the oil out of Persia, out of Iran. And you go back and you read the dialogue between some of those high-level people, and you read the same dialogue you're reading today with regard to Iraq. Empire and imperialism, that's what it was all about. And Dennis is absolutely right in that regard. And much of the things that were redacted from his book were redacted for embarrassment. And he and I both know that because we've both been there. The publisher actually sued on the initial redactions, which were huge. And when they won the case and got the redactions reduced, all you saw in the redactions that came back into the text and were published was embarrassment. Kind of like Julian Assange. Never violated anybody's security. What he did was violate their lives and violate their lack of integrity and their machinations and such. And I think that that probably bothered Dennis as much as anything else. Is okay, look at what they did, because Dennis, as he will tell you, was on the committee that did the redactions for Douglas Feist's book. And I asked him one time, I said, how do you think George Tenet got produced at the center of the storm, that big tome of a book that George wrote, and there isn't a single redaction in it? Well, he the boss man. He the boss man. You know, you don't redact the director of the CIA because he's telling lie after lie after lie after lie. And the only thing you would redact for was lack of integrity and truth. And they don't do that at the CIA. And you look at Feist's book, which Dennis was a part of the committee that looked at possible potential redactions. Nothing is redacted in Doug Feist's book. Dennis will tell you that had it been, Doug would have got it restored.
Yeah, the redactions in this book are annoying because a lot of the times they're in parts where you would think that they would be interesting to what he said was probably interesting. They probably redacted some of the best stuff in the book, I would guess, because the placement of them is just kind of infuriating. You looked at an earlier version of it. Are you able or at liberty to speak to what was redacted that we should be aware of?
I would just say, I can't do specifics, but I would just say that it's mostly embarrassment. It's policy exposure. It's not secret exposure. It's not operational or strategic secrets that are being exposed. It's people's decision-making and the heinous nature and quality of that decision-making. Or it's even worse than that. It's the kind of decision-making that got young men and women killed. And that's
Right.
what Gary does in his text too. When you read Gary's book, and Gary's a West Point graduate. Gary was an oil man par excellence. He spent 75 months in Iraq. He is more than any other single individual. He'll never tell you this, but I will tell you this, responsible for Iraq's oil ministry recovering in some sort of healthy way, at least. Could have been a lot better, but there were so many forces working against it, political and sectarian. But Gary knows his business, and he knows, for example, who gave him certain orders that he decided to disregard because they were coming from Israel. He knew they were coming from Israel. He knew that Tommy Franks was given an order to bomb a target in Syria, which was involved with Israel's desire to do this to certain aspects of the oil business. No one else knew it was an order. Paul Wolfowitz gave the order to Tommy Franks, General Tommy Franks, in charge of the operation in Iraq. Rumsfeld didn't know it was given. The president didn't know it was given. Tommy Franks carried it out and bombed the target. Assuming, I've got to say in Tommy's defense, assuming that the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, wouldn't give him an order to do something like that unless he'd cleared it with his boss, and his boss had cleared it with the National Security Council and the president. Pretty broad assumption on his part, but that's the kind of individual General Franks was.
Yes, and he's there calling Feith. I mean, he famously called him like the stupidest person on the planet, and it was a Feith. He referred to Feith that way, and it's funny because when I was doing canvassing in 2004, I had all these conversations with. We were often in heavily Jewish neighborhoods for like fundraising efforts and stuff like that, and just voter outreach or whatever. And so I had a lot of conversations with people, and they were in fairly wealthy areas. So some of these people are connected to establishment people. One guy was a cousin of Feith, and he said that he was a supreme idiot. But that conflicts with what Fritz says. Fritz actually sees him as kind of a cunning person. And it made me ponder what Franks was on about this and this cousin. And I after thinking about it, I think that he's the kind of person who has this prime directive of whatever he has to achieve, and will just no matter what is presented to him, he's going to stick to something to where it may seem like just that he's an idiot or something, but it really has to do with his overall commitments ideologically and politically. And I think it's to this neocon, greater Israel agenda of also pacifying the Middle East and so on. So where do you think that he is stupid, or is he stupid like a fox?
A little bit of the latter, I think. But I think the degree to which he is pledged to Israel gives people that kind of idea about him, because when you're that way, as were several other people, Gary talks about one who would give him orders over the telephone from, he didn't even know where he was coming from. He didn't know who he was working for or anything else, but he gave him orders as if he were the man speaking on the telephone. Gary learned to disregard him. I think when you're so single-minded like they are, that you give off this idea or this characterization of yourself as being a Luddite or worse. You're just idiot. And I got to say this, I don't give Tommy Franks really high marks either, especially after the conversations that he and Colin Powell had over he didn't have enough troops. He didn't have enough troops. You're not going to do anything but get bogged down, et cetera, et cetera. And Franks's remarks finally were in some frustration. What would you just don't believe it? Rumsfeld wanted me to do it with 55,000. 55,000. I'm lucky to have the 160 some odd thousand. And of course, he didn't even get that because the one division didn't land. But it was clear that Franks was not putting up a whole lot of pushback and wasn't willing to say, okay, Mr. Secretary, I'm out of here. I'm out of here. I'm not going to do this and get a whole bunch of boys and girls killed and maybe have to kill a whole lot of Iraqis. I'm not going to do this. But think about this for a minute. 20 years we have been at war, and we have failed miserably. We failed in Libya. We failed in Afghanistan. We failed in Syria. We failed in Iraq. And not a single solitary general was ever held accountable. We just changed them every year virtually. That's our way of doing business now. There is no accountability whatsoever. So I don't say that Franks is any different from the rest of them, David Petraeus included, who is responsible for so many lies. It's pitiful. And he continues to lie, for example, telling everyone 6 months after the invasion of Ukraine that Russia would be defeated speedily, that everything would be over quite quickly, that the Russians weren't what they were. Look at him now. He's out there trying to backtrack and back up. We haven't had a competent general officer, a competent flag officer in a long time, which is why a lot of them are getting into trouble. But no accountability.
Yeah. I mean, it seems that's a systemic feature because if you're going to advance in that hierarchy, you have to demonstrate, I think, complete fealty to just top-down management of whatever the regime is going to have you do. So you only get yes men. It seems to be emblematic of like all the other problems with late empire, that it's you just wonder, are there any smart people in this country of 300 million people? And yeah, there are plenty of them. Are there any smart, ethical, moral people? Many of them, but they are, and therefore they are all disqualified from being in positions of power. And that's how we end up with this dysfunction.
You put your finger on it. That's the principal problem. And if you look at Peter Farrakhan's book, the Silk Roads, A New World History, is a marvelous read in that respect. 1,000 empires over 3,000 years. You're looking at really powerful empires like the British at the end, or the Moguls, or the Mongols, or who knew that the Mongols were in Poland in 1240? Every one of them, virtually, with their own characteristics, especially the more powerful ones, does what we're doing to ourselves right now to themselves. So you look at it and you say, does anyone ever learn any lessons from history? Does anyone ever listen to the people who were naysayers, the Jeremiahs for the Jews, for example, who told them, watch out, you're going to be beaten? And then they were beaten, roundly beaten, and the temple was crashed and everything else. Does anyone ever listen to the people who were all around the British Empire at the time that they were going through their beginning of their fall in 1890 and then on, as they just went to war after war after war, and as they bled their economy dry, and then as they got into World War I and bled it so badly, and we made a fortune off of them, and therefore then officially replaced them. we pretty much replaced them economically in the 1890s. But by the time we get to 1920, they're a basket case waiting only for 1956 and the Suez Canal crisis for a person who loved them, had spent lots of World War II in their country, Dwight Eisenhower, to essentially tell them, get out, go home now. And no, our empire's over. My God. Are we at that point today and we have no one to do that to us because there is nothing but a multipolar world out there? Or are several of those poles coalescing now? And are we going to be told the same thing very shortly? With $50.7 trillion of debt staring us in the face, according to the Congressional Budget Office, by 2034, with an already $1 trillion plus interest payment on that debt, which we dare not renege on, that will be in 2034 the equivalent of Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and the defense budget if we pay it. Are we going down? Looks to me like we are. And Peter Farrakhan's book is a wonderful guide to the history and rise and fall of empire.
Right, and when you try to look at what has been driving this, and it gets into what was driving the Iraq War, it's this neoconservative consensus that emerged. And is this a question of just belligerent people who want empire for various reasons related to imperialism, or have the neocons been driven fundamentally by this very belligerent form of Zionism? And I mean, I didn't think this so much. I thought it was more of in the past. I think that what happened since October 7 has really clarified things more and made me go back and look at this history. But it seems that the schism of the U.S. empire with people like H.W. Bush and the sort of Rockefeller, old Council on Foreign Relations, the old Eastern establishment, was more. They wanted a more prudent policy, as Bush always said, because that was a more sensible way to run the empire. But for the neoconservatives who were devoted to that Israel project, Greater Israel, they have a different motivation. I was a little disappointed that Fritz did not mention the clean break paper that Bibi Netanyahu commissioned and had Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz and Worms are working on it, because it lays out, to me, I think when you look at that and then you look at what follows, the 9/11 wars, especially Iraq war, and then the Arab Spring wars, it all seems to be of a piece, along with this war now in this, I don't even want to call it a war, this genocidal pogrom in Gaza. This I think is key, and yet it's still, even as I say it, I feel like, I got to say this so carefully, because it's just so terrible that they were able to steer U.S. policy in this direction. And who wants to go around blaming Zionism for this, given the history and the taboos against it? But it's so destructive to U.S. foreign policy, and even from the purpose of greedy imperialism, it's so stupid, and it's going to end the whole empire. It looks like the neocons.
It's counteractive even to those people who are left, who are true imperialists, if you will, and realize that there are certain aspects of what we're doing now, deadly aspects of what we're doing now, that are detrimental to their future, detrimental to their billionaire status, detrimental to the status of everything that America supposedly, even at the height of empire, is doing and stands for. But they can't get a hold of the reins of power because these people have absorbed them. And absorb is a good term to use, because you never know where the next you really don't know where the next pearl is located, or Victoria Nuland, or because they're very well disguised. We're always worried about Russian sleepers in our midst. We've got Zionist sleepers in our midst. And we've got a lot of people who aren't necessarily Zionists, but who are hooked onto that train in our midst. I think I'm almost at the point where I go back and say, those people who talk about the biblical connection between Israel and America, and that being absolutely essential to bringing about the rapture in bringing about the return to the 1,000-year kingdom of their Jesus Christ with a flaming sword, if necessary, to kill all the unbelievers, aren't onto something. That this lockup that we have with this country, unlike any in our history, in fact, unlike any in the history of empire or nations since Westphalia, at least, I can't find anything in Farrakhan's book that even comes close to the kind of lash up that the two states of Israel and the United States have right now. It's not, as some say, it used to say to me all the time when I was at the State Department, well, you know, Israel's our 51st state. We just haven't declared it. No, that's not the case. They're worse than being a state because there'd be apparatus we could check them with if they were states, like the Constitution, for example.
Yeah, South Dakota could not goad us into a series of disastrous wars in the Middle East that would bankrupt the country and end the U.S. empire. They're worse than a 51st state.
I thought 2 or 3 years ago, when I made the statement that kind of went viral, the New York Times would no longer talk to me after I made the statement, that Israel would not be a state in 20 years. I thought that was a pretty good estimate. Little did I know that Israel might not be a state in the next 13, 14 months. They certainly will not be a Jewish state. If they elect to continue to be a Jewish state, they're going to be destroyed. They may be destroyed anyway. But they've set up all the conditions for their disappearance from the Levant. And my grave concern, and I know this sounds like I am being biblical, but my grave concern is that they'll pull us in with them. And it won't be for us existential, but it will be existential for empire. It will be, because we will come home with our tail between our legs, roundly defeated, and the world and most of the powers in that world, including powers like India and Turkey, who are sitting on the sideline to a certain extent right now, waiting to see what happens, they will all be against us. And you can't survive in a world like that, not as powerful as we are now.
Yeah, I think that you're right about that, about this paradox of multipolarity, in that what was unipolarity responded to the potential threat of multipolarity, and in so doing acted so aggressively that it united the rest of the world, the people who were pro multipolarity. So we functionally have something of a bipolar world, which is basically the West versus everybody else. And then it also becomes clear that, in a sense, that's what it always was, except the confrontation was so lopsided, it didn't quite seem that way. But increasingly, to me, this is just Columbus, from Columbus to now, just Western imperialism behaving badly has been the driving thing in world history. And it's I guess that's becoming more evident to more in the world's population. And I don't think there's any coming back from this, to be honest. I don't think that you can restore the mystique of the white world anymore.
I think you're right, and I think that's a sad and grievous thing, because I don't know what's going to replace it. And when you look again at the history of empire, there can be some pretty deadly and bloody times in the wake of a giant disappearing or going out. I remember Ricardo Alarcón, who was then head of the National Assembly in Cuba, telling me when we were talking about similar things, and he looked at me and he said, "Yeah, but even a dying elephant can thrash a lot of grass." And we're close. We're 90 miles from Miami. And he had a point. He had a point. Here's what I think really troubles me right now, though. I think that in order to prevent what we're talking about right now, in a last-ditch effort, perhaps, to prevent it, we would use nuclear weapons. And that really alarms me, because there are no inhibitions to that. Not really. If the empire thinks, let's say it gets involved in something that grows out of what it's involved in right now, most potent of which would be a war with China, we're going to lose. In the opening days, we're going to lose. We're going to lose badly. We're going to have 10,000 casualties a week, if not more. Two carriers going down is 10,000 casualties in 30 minutes. Will we go nuclear? The only thing I have to consult is a very, very bad decision, sad decision, to use nuclear weapons in 1945. And that decision and the haste with which it was made and the reasons I now know it was made trouble me. We might do the same thing again. We simply do not have the conventional military power, despite all the protests to the contrary by everybody from our military leaders to our Secretary of Defense to, the rest of the world fears America. We spend more money than anybody else. Well, half of the money we spend, close to $1 trillion annually, half of it goes to pay for the all-volunteer force, which is enormously expensive, and the other half goes to pay the CEO salaries of Lockheed Martin and a whole bunch of other people out there who make really shitty equipment and sell it to us at astronomical prices. So all that money we spend really is inconsequential in terms of the operational effectiveness of the military. And we're going to find that out. And we're going to find it out in spades if we get in something like this. So what will we do? My calculation is we'll use nuclear weapons.
Right. That whole threat hangs over us. It's, I was close to Daniel Ellsberg and read his nuclear memoir, and it's they're crazier now. They were dangerous lunatics back then, and now I think that they're even more senseless. I mean, some of the decisions they make. If I could get back to the Fritz book here, which is just shows this kind of dark mentality that you can't understand, but it seems to be sinister and not simply incompetence. This issue, that one of the issues that Fritz looks at as like a lingering mystery, is who and why, who was responsible for it, and why did they handle the post-invasion that way? In particular, why did they dissolve the Iraqi state? And I think that in a sense they may have wanted a certain amount of chaos because otherwise they wouldn't be able to stay there. And when you think of how sinister that logic is, it also raises the question of ISIS. What the hell is ISIS? It sure did come at a convenient time and suit U.S. political purposes very well. So that is the mentality.
ISIS was the leadership of ISIS, not the Islam-imbued leadership, the caliphate-producing leadership, but the real leadership of ISIS that knew how to use fire direction centers in very sophisticated equipment, that knew how to use artillery and direct rounds and use tanks and such like. They were the Sunnis. They were the Sunnis from Iraq whom we had allowed to become totally disenchanted, whom David Petraeus's surge proved to their leadership, we can't deal with these people. We cannot deal with these people. They're going to put the Shia in charge, and we are going to be second, third, fourth class citizens. What were they doing? What was our placed in place prime minister doing at that time? Putting the Sunnis in jail or murdering them. That's what he was doing. So the Sunnis go off, and the Sunnis become ISIS. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the crazy nut who they put in charge, was just the surface material. And when he was killed, we got worse surface material.
Do you mean Baghdadi?
Yeah.
Yeah, you said. I think you said Zarqawi, but he was the earlier.
Zarqawi was the beginning of it.
He was like Al Qaeda in Iraq or something, right?
Yeah. Well, he wasn't really Al Qaeda though. He really wasn't. He was a poison maker in the mountains that Saddam knew all about. I've got the NSA. Well, I don't have them anymore, but I had the NSA intercepts of his telephone calls. And what he was doing was selling to the highest bidder wherever he could sell it, whether it was nerve agent or blood poison or whatever he was making. And Saddam didn't like him too much any more than anybody else because Saddam knew he was working for the highest bidder. And he was turned into a powerful figure by us and doing what we did in order to give him that motivation and that place from which he could do it. So he started assembling the complex, and then it got picked up by others who had different ideas, like building a caliphate and all that. But it was very conducive to our coming back. And it was conducive to our coming back to a president who did not want to come back. I mean, Obama did not want to come back. And he wound up having to come back because it looked like the experiment was going to go to hell so badly and so quickly that if we didn't go back, we'd have a real mess. And he probably was right about that. Frankly, I think the Iraqis could have handled it all on their own, but it's easy for me to say I wasn't president.
Well,
And it did.
yeah, they wanted. I mean, it was around the time that the agreement was that the U.S. was about to pull out that this happens. I mean, it really did give the U.S. a pretext for going back in there. Even the question of Zarqawi, when he was before the war, they were using him as a way to say, "Oh, look at Iraq's connections to Al Qaeda." However, where was he? He was in Kurdistan, as I understand it.
Yeah, he was in the mountains, and Saddam didn't even like him.
Right, and Kurdistan is an ally of Israel, really. I mean, it's you can see
their oil to Israel.
The neocon syndicate, or whatever the sort of spooky deep state networks that proliferate, especially in that part of the world. They seem to be, I mean, you can think that they may have actually wanted him there for that very reason, that you put him there, and it gives you a reason. And it also makes you think about ISIS in the same way. This is another question that I would have for you is I'm of the belief that the Arab Spring was essentially a continuation of the PNAC agenda, because you really couldn't do it another way. You couldn't have any pretext for these wars with the old war on terror paradigm. And you look at the book by Fritz points out that Douglas Feith in 2011 said that late 2011 says Obama will pay for being anti-Israel. So do you think that the Obama administration and the Arab Spring and the Arab Spring Wars, do you think that this was partly a way for the Obama people to try to appease? Because they did go into Syria up to a point, and they're very, pretty guilty of that. However, Obama finally is like, no, this is too much. I'm not going to go in there. Do you think that was a continuation of the PNAC agenda? And do you think that Obama was more or less pressured into doing that, sort of like Bill Clinton was pressured into signing the Iraqi Liberation Act?
I do, but I think Obama was a little smarter than Clinton and figured it out fairly swiftly once it became evident all around him. And it was evident all around him because of people like Samantha Power, whom otherwise he couldn't figure out, and Hillary Clinton, warmonger par excellence, Hillary Clinton. But I don't think Obama even realized how much she was a warmonger until we came to that moment when she revealed it to the world by saying, "We came, we saw, and he died." The most impolitic remark a diplomat for the United States has ever made, probably. When I met with President Obama in the Roosevelt Room a year before his second term expired, we were supposed to be there, me and General Paul Eaton and a couple of other people, we were supposed to be there to be thanked for our assistance in getting very, very difficult times the Congress not to kill the JCPOA. They pretty much put it on life support, but they didn't kill it. AIPAC's first real defeat, strategic defeat. Obama came into the room allegedly for 10 to 15 minutes to make a few remarks and thank us, with John Kerry at his side, then Secretary of State. He sat down across from us and he began a disquisition on his first years in the presidency up to that moment. In other words, 7+ years. His first words were to me, I put them at the head of my syllabus at William and Mary after that. There's a bias in this town toward war. General Eaton came forward in his seat. I came forward in my seat. And for 30 minutes, he was only supposed to spend 15 minutes there. For 30 minutes, and John Kerry was looking like, what is going on here? Because he was talking to his Secretary of State, too, whom you may recall at that time was advocating for ground troops in Syria. So he was talking to us, he was talking to himself, and he was talking to John Kerry. He went on to say, I don't know what to do about it. I'm puzzled, I'm befuddled, I don't know what to do about it. But it is very poisonous and very dangerous. There's a bias in this town. We go to war over a drop of a hat. And I don't think he was profoundly into it in terms that you would say, I think I was at that time after teaching it for 14 or 15 years, but he got it in terms of the pressures and the possibilities from those pressures, and that even a president and his staff, handpicked, couldn't stand up to it, couldn't avoid it. So we left there. Paul Eaton and I in the West Wing were standing out. We went into the Oval Office and had we had a photo with him and everything. Then Paul and I went into the West Wing, the anteroom there, and we said, "To whom do you think he was talking?" and I said, "Well, I think he was talking to himself, first and foremost. Second, he was talking to his Secretary of State. And incidentally, he was talking to us." And he said, "I got the same feeling." I think that's true. He was a very puzzled man at that point. Very puzzled man. He just dispatched Samantha Power for what she had done to him with regard to Libya to be the United Nations ambassador, because he got her out of his hair and he didn't want any more of that. And of course, he'd gotten rid of Hillary. But, he had these people around him. I would put Hillary right up there in the top ranks with Victoria Nuland. She might not have had a card in her wallet saying she was a neocon, but she was every bit as responsible for some of the fracases that turned sour as any neocon. So they've got a lot of allies throughout the structure too. Allies who are genuine imperialists and think they're doing the right thing for the preservation of the empire, and always the preservation of their status and riches in that empire.
Yes, this is the conundrum that we're in if we're concerned about this, that the way to advance is to be a tool for these kinds of people. And so there's no real institution. There's nobody with lots of money who says, I want to put together a really critical group of scholars and I want to publicize them so they can move America in a more peaceful, cooperative direction, because there's just no easy money to be made by doing that. And people that acquire a lot of money have the mentality of, let's make a lot of money. Or they wouldn't have been in that position in the first place. It really puts us in a difficult position. And the pushback against this, do you see it in some ways? I mean, when I don't know if you know Richard Immerman. He was a history professor, and I think had some connection to intelligence because he wrote the first thing on the declassified documents related to Guatemala in 1954, and then in 2000 and maybe in 06, he is tasked with writing the NIE for Iran. And the neocons were freaking out about this at the time. But there was some kind of pushback in the aftermath of the immediate, in the second half of Bush's presidency, second term. There were articles like a Vanity Fair article on how Dennis Hastert was taking money from Turkish lobby connected to heroin. And there was about Sibel Edmonds, and her story was that these people were connected to people like Pearl and Grossman in the Turkish lobby, and that they were connected. They were very pro-Israel people. So she was describing kind of a neocon mafia thing, and Dennis Hastert didn't accuse them of libel or anything like that. Yep. And it was in Vanity Fair. And then later, of course, you find out that he's like the most blackmailable person ever, that he was a pedophile, and that he wasn't very charismatic. You're left with the conclusion that he became Speaker of the House because he was a pedophile, because he was so blackmailable. That is an astounding thing. They push back against it a little bit. Eventually, he goes down. Years later, after several terms as Speaker of the House, you had Brzezinski warning them in 2007 to Congress, like they're going to stage an attack, or there's going to be a terrorist attack that'll be blamed on Iran, and we're going to go to war, and it's going to be a disaster. So there's still some parts of the establishment that can sort of push back at the abyss. Is that still there today? Does Biden? What do you make of the people around Biden? Is there anybody that's going to? They've avoided disaster so far. Give Biden credit. The human race still exists. He hasn't brought us to the end yet. But is there anybody that's going to? Do you see any people around there that are responsible at the top?
Let me answer that question indirectly through the 25th Amendment. The reason the 25th Amendment will never work, and there were people who said this when it was passed, is because those cabinet officers responsible for making it work won't make it work, because they realize that if their sugar daddy leaves, they might leave too. That is to say, there's no reason that the vice president or whomever might become, you don't have to select the vice president. whomever might become president through using the 25th Amendment is going to keep you on. So the very first thing that every cabinet officer thinks about, with very little exception these days, very little exception, is self-preservation. And that is a truism that I think we could probably never get rid of now. Never get rid of, because the kind of people who come up to be cabinet officers are those kind of people. You take Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, any of those people who are powerful in the Bush or in the Biden administration, or go back to the Bush administration, George W. And those people they're more or less locked into the president for hell or high water, because it's their future, it's their life, it's their power, it's their prerogative. And you can't find anybody who will deviate from that. Someone who would act on their conscience based on moral courage is almost a non-starter in America today. It just can't happen. In the Congress, in the Supreme Court, although I will say that Sotomayor's dissent on the recent Supreme Court decision was a beautiful dissent, and she told the truth. But she's protected. She's protected. She's in there for life unless she, murders somebody or whatever. And I'm not even sure that would get you lifted from the Supreme Court today. But anyone who is vulnerable in any way, fashion, or form is not going to do anything that even remotely resembles moral courage or integrity, let alone physical courage. None is going to do it. We had a conversation, we being some general officers, recently, and we were talking about the NDAA and an amendment, the National Defense Authorization Act, and an amendment proposed there too that would make women vulnerable for the draft and get this business started of perhaps having to have a draft in the future, and so getting the camel's nose under the tent and all that stuff. The consensus of those old flag officers like me, the consensus was that half of American draftable youth between the ages of 18 and 24 would be across the Canadian or the Mexican border the moment it was announced. That's not a reflection on their integrity or moral courage or physical courage or anything else. It's a reflection on the fact that we don't understand even our own people anymore because we don't give a damn about them. We don't give a damn about them. I remember Medea being in the Congress and approaching Steny Hoyer and saying, "You've made 18 trips to Israel, Congressman, 18 trips to Israel, but we checked your travel record. You've only made one trip to your home state of Maryland. One trip. You made 18 to Israel." Of course, he doesn't even want to talk to him. They can't get anywhere near him now because they embarrass the hell out of him. Medea is my hero right now, going around the Congress and sticking her microphone in people's faces and getting some of them initially to turn around and say, "I wish they'd kill every damn one of those Arabs." That got them in hot water quickly, so they quit talking to her. They just ignore her now.
Right. I mean, I think that's sort of the general approach, is just to avoid any serious questions about these things or longer exchanges with people. It's more choreographed. Biden is in this bubble. It's really something. The last question I want to ask you before we close here is about something that you've mentioned before, and I was wondering if you had any definitive sources on this. It's about the theft of Iraqi oil under the sanctions regime. With Mark Rich being involved in this and his company Glencore, right, which is one of the most rapacious entities, really almost a caricature of corporate greed, really an imperialist corporate greed, because they're always in these poorer countries like Peru, just stealing whatever is worth stealing. So what can you say about Rich and Netanyahu and the theft of Iraqi oil with that sanctions regime that apparently made Bibi and his friends very rich and killed 500,000 children in Iraq, which Madeleine Albright said was worth the price. And then, what do we make of that? So could you elaborate on that and maybe recommend any sources on that?
The source I would recommend is the man I was just telling you about, Gary Vogler, who put me onto it in a big way. Gary's been in the oil business for a very long time. And he will tell you that the head man that we put into Iraq, I forget his name now, but he was in the oil business and even at a higher level. I think he was CEO of one of the bigger oil companies. He left, came into Gary one day and said, "I'm out of here. Wait, Gary said. You said you would stay. You will uncover me. I don't have half the expertise or connections you do in Washington. Come on. And he said, no, why? Gary said, I think I knew when I asked that question. I think I knew why, because I was having some of the same feelings. He said, you don't need to know. He just left. Overnight, he left. And Gary said, I began to learn through the rest of my 74, 75 months over there what was really going on. So Gary would be the person I'd point at. But here's what I know and what Gary has in some ways illuminated for me. And let me start by saying, as I think we intimated about some of these people, even Douglas Fite, I don't think Mark Rich's primary purpose was to make money. Now, he did hand over foot, and he shared in it with others like Netanyahu, and I think Ariel Sharon too. It was to make sure Israel was the most powerful state in the land. It was to make sure that Israel would build more billionaires per capita than the United States of America, which it did. It was to make sure Israel had the most powerful possible economy to put behind what was a killing machine. As Moshahad, I think it was, a former director of the IDF, said, when you have to kill people periodically throughout your statehood, you're not going to be a state all that long, because you can't get away. Well, that's what they were funding. That's what Mark Rich was funding, the ability of Israel to kill its way into perpetual statehood, into the Zionist dream, because that's what they've been doing. That's what they started in the King David Hotel, killing Brits. What did they do? Kill 1,200 or so with the terrorist attack this 1948 on. So Rich, I think his primary motivation was Israel. That he made a lot of money in the course of it was proof positive of his genius in terms of working the system. And the most prolific and beneficial working the system was taking oil out of the UN Oil for Food program and getting it, because Saddam was desperate, at a very discounted price, and then not doing much to that discount. A little bit, because you had to make some yourself, and we're talking about quantities here that are huge, $9 billion worth, and $9 billion was the residual in the UN Oil for Food program when we got there, $9 billion. So he peeled that off, and he gave this oil at a discount to Israel, and that financed Benjamin Netanyahu's rise to prime ministership as finance minister, who was responsible for this dream come true for all Israelis, and made them all love him, which they still do today for that reason, not necessarily for what he's doing in Gaza or the hostage return. And that's souring them pretty much. But still, the polls will show you 65, 70% of Jewish Israelis support Netanyahu and what he's doing. It made him a hero. And it also funded that campaign that he ran that got Yitzhak Rabin assassinated. There's no question in my mind that Benjamin Netanyahu knew what he was doing. That when that settler walked up and stuck that pistol in Yitzhak Rabin and shot him and killed him, and then later Bibi, as prime minister, resurrects him and makes him a hero amongst the settler community, he orchestrated that. He was as responsible for that assassination as a young settler. He provoked into doing it. And the rest of the story is known. You know, his success, his political success, is largely, as Gary Vogel will tell you, based on his ability to bring that energy to Israel at a time when they thought they were running out, and they knew and were desperate that they had to find new sources. Now, what's the latest thing that Bibi Netanyahu has done with regard to the massive gas find in the Eastern Mediterranean that was heretofore to be shared 50-50 with the Gazans because it's in their territory? He's taking the whole thing over.
Right.
Oh, I've solved your problem for the next 10 years. Average Jewish Israeli citizen. I've solved it. Look what I've done. Now, it remains to be seen if he's going to be allowed to get away with that, but I'll put money on it that he will be if he survives.
If he survives, and if Israel survives, I mean, I really wonder how much this is tenable, because the U.S. position is so fragile, and it hinges. Israel's plans hinge on having the U.S. as a trump card And so I don't know how much longer that's going to last. That's where this may well seem like almost like a mafia story, really. I mean, these people the fact that the sanctions regime existed, to my mind, was in considerable part Western manipulation of oil markets, that you just basically you come up with some pretext to put sanctions on them, and then this country that has so much oil that it basically just squirts out of the ground with not
Look at
much
Iran.
sulfur in it.
Look at
And,
Iran today. Yeah.
yeah, and they were like, well, we'll just take that off the market, and it made British North Sea oil suddenly like worth exploiting because otherwise it's too expensive to extract. And then on top of that, while these people are starving in Iraq, you have these gangster characters who are like, well, why don't we just take some of it and use it to make some Israelis super rich, and in the meantime, some of these Israelis will lobby for another war to completely destroy your country, Iraq. I mean, this is it's like is it world history? Is it like a Scorsese mob flick? It's amazing that that's where we're at.
But if you look at the British Empire in particular, I mean, the details are not granular on the Mughals or the Mongols or the Persians, but the details are fairly granular on the British Empire. They're closer at hand too, of course, and lots more historians compile them. If you look at that, it's not much different. The British government actually gets angry at the British East India Company because they got more power than the British government. It reminds you of who was the guy who ran all those security people out there in Iraq and elsewhere? Prince, Eric Prince.
Yeah, Blackwater guy.
He had his own East India Company. Not for the last time has that phenomenon haunted empire. I mean, look at Russia, for example, the Wagner Group. You have certain things that you put together for outsiders to do, and the outsiders have this extraordinary ability to exploit those things within the guidance and without the guidance that you gave them, that they become more powerful than you.
Yes, this is the oligarchy creates the regime to run an empire, but that creates all sorts of strange institutions and other formations, and it creates a new oligarchy, and we're back where you've got even worse people in charge. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to For Die Trying for supporting the Devil's Chess Club. Visit fordietrying.com for details. And don't forget to subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for the best coverage of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. This includes our new series on the global drug meta group, a milieu that appears to have staged the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings, which were blamed on Chechen jihadis, though some Americans would call it a Russian false flag. Those attacks are sometimes described as the Russian 9/11. We argue that, and I think you'll agree if you look at the suppressed evidence, the Russian 9/11 was carried out by drug trafficking, anti-Russian, pro-Western forces. Furthermore, there's reason to believe or suspect that some of these networks were also deeply involved in the American 9/11 a couple years later. The story is laid out on the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Lastly, I want to thank Lawrence Wilkerson for speaking with us today. He comes from a very different background than me, and we probably look at some things very differently, but I really appreciate his courage speaking out about the depravity of the U.S. empire and doing so with real insider knowledge. There are very, very few people who do this. He could throw up his hands, retire, and withdraw from this whole mess, but instead he is here and on other media outlets talking about extremely urgent facts that we in the U.S. and the rest of the world must face. We need much more of this. We need more people who can shed light on how the game is played on the devil's chessboard.